This is The Right Approach. I'm J.W. Judge, and with me is my co-host Barbara Hinsky. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft and business of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is Joni B. Cole. She is the author of 7 books, including the new release, Party Like It's 2044, Finding the Funny in Life and Death. She has taught creative writing to adults for 25 years. And Joni, I first came across you in an article you wrote on Jane Friedman's website. And in the second paragraph, when I saw the title of that collection of essays, and particularly the subtitle of Finding the Funny in Life and Death, like we hadn't met, but I knew that you were my people.
Like
and
that.
I will give you an example for whatever this says about me. We were at my grandfather's funeral. He lived into his 80s, so it was a good, happy life. And I leaned over and said to my cousin, when we had been at the graveside funeral, we were then eating the dinner, the potluck dinner, whatever you call it at that point, that all the people bring the food and you eat it. And I leaned over to my cousin and said something to the effect of, "You can't spell funeral without FUN." And my mother overheard me, and the look of shock and horror on her face that I would say that at a funeral, um, I haven't forgotten it. I assume she hasn't either, but that's that's where I am.
I admire you for saying that, JW. It's like putting the fun in dysfunctional, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it's important to find your people too, who have the same kind of appreciation for humor. I was at a conference in Missouri a few months ago with a bunch of lawyers and insurance folks, and I found that the table I was sitting at, those people had the same appreciation for dark humor that only lawyers and insurance people and folks who deal with these things all day, every day can probably have. And I knew that I was going to be okay at that conference because I'd found a group of people that had the same gallows humor that I did.
That's the good table to sit at. You want to be at that table.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So tell us, in fact, I think the timing of this worked out really well because we just interviewed an author, Kira Davis, and talked a little bit about humor in writing and how difficult that is to do effectively. So I want to talk about some of your tips you have to write humor effectively. What's a good jumping in point for us?
Let's see. Well, these aren't really in any hierarchy, but as a jumping off point for me, one thing that I learned when the humor in an essay was failing was I was trying too hard. So I think one of the things to remember, certainly in the revision stage, which frankly is where a lot of the humor got inserted into my writing, it's a revision process. It's not like, oh, I'm hilarious from the beginning, but when I couldn't make it work, very often I would finally catch on, oh, you're trying too hard. Because once someone tells you you're funny or you're put in the humor genre, or there are some elements of finding the funny in a piece, I think, at least for me, the impulse is sometimes to now work it too hard, to try too hard at it. And very often scaling back, pulling back, let a moment just be a moment was sort of a catch at the end. So that's certainly probably more of something I would look at in the back of the revision process. Did I try too hard? Is that why it's not working? But it served me well to remember not everything has to be a laugh riot. Not everything has to be funny, no matter what genre you're in. And I'm not really a humor writer, but there's a lot of humor in my work that I've been told that. And so I've kind of come to recognize that in a way that now, well, then I want to treat it like a narrative technique when it serves. But that first insight I'd like to share is, but when it's not serving, then abandon the humor. You don't need to make it work if it's not working. Don't try too hard.
When you were told that your writing was humorous, is that something you already knew about yourself? I mean, do you consider yourself to be a funny person, or do others, or was that a revelation for you?
Yeah. Well, my partner would say, you just think you're so funny because all the time I'm going around saying I'm so funny. But as a writer, I did not, that was not on the front burner. That was not, I'm going to be in this genre at all. And it can sound very almost duplicitous for me to say, oh, I was so surprised when people, and many of the reviews were related to, oh, this is really funny work. But I truly was, because if you look at the topics of which my essay collections engender, cruelty, racism, loss, family drama, relationship challenges, this is not funny material. And so when then I would get that feedback that humor was quite a significant element in my writing, I began to study, well, why? Why is it? And it's interesting because before I was doing something maybe more naturally, but now that I really see it, that's where I might sometimes have that misguided impulse to try to push it too far. But it has helped me now that I recognize that that is a feature, a strength of my writing. It is not the entirety of my writing, but to see it as a narrative technique, the same way I look at dialogue or scenic action or the balance of exposition and showing, telling and showing. So I really do look at it more in the revision stage as, have you availed yourself of it where it's an organic element? Have you pushed too hard? Have you missed an opportunity? Are you using it in a way that's appropriate or not inappropriate? And, right down to the line editing stage, some words are funnier than others. So if there is a humor moment, then I'll look at it and use narrative techniques to kind of make it work a little bit better. But yeah, I did not, it took me by surprise, the feedback I get on this newest collection and in the previous one.
But I know that, go ahead, Barb.
I am fascinated by this. When you go back in your revision process, how do you identify the places, the scenes, or whatever, where you think, yeah, that's kind of funny? Does it strike you as funny, or is it hunt and pack?
Yeah. It's interesting because some of the things that make any writing good, like in a scene, should it be a scene? What should that size of that scene be? And how do you integrate the 4 elements that make a scene, so that they're all creating a seamless experience, an immersive experience. And so those same things I look at in terms of any scene, because in my essays, they're very scenic. I'll put you at this meeting or I'll put you in this situation. So there's a lot of telling in my essays, but they're also punctuated by big interludes of scenes. And the same thing that I do when I look at, is this scene working? Is it too big for the purpose that it serves in the piece or whatever? I'll kind of review it also in terms of the elements of humor. Specifically, for example, detail. If I put a character on stage myself, when I write in the personal essay genre, so this is not made up stuff, though a lot of my essays definitely cross a line, but you're well aware of it in the book. But, was that detail more significant and telling and meaningful than, say, a more bland detail? So for example, I might bring a character on stage who I say is wearing a plaid shirt, but is the better detail that she was wearing an apron that said, I love basting on it, and one is funnier than the other. But not only is it funnier than the other, it's better characterization. So they're really of the same lens, through the same lens. What makes a better way to characterize someone on the page is often the same thing that will make it bring the humor forth. And when I say humor, in most cases, I'm also really speaking to what it brings forth is humanity. I don't put people on stage to make them look funny, or put myself, because it's personal genre that I'm writing in, seem funnier. That I just try to really capture humanity. And that, if you really pay attention, is just rift with humor. As JW was talking about, even in the darkest situations, humanity comes forth, and there is humor organic to most situations in life. And that isn't necessarily that, bend over, guffawing type of humor, but that sweet humor, that poignant humor, things like that. So I use the same lens to make a scene a better scene that I do to bring forth the humor when it feels appropriate. And in that case, it was a detail. This detail characterized the character by her plaid shirt, but this detail really characterized her and happened to be and convey the sweetness of her personality. So,
Yeah. And I find when I incorporate humor elements into my stories. I mean, they're
good.
thrillers, they're dark, but I feel, it's kind of like, I'm not a foodie by any means, but we watched the Great British Bake Off, and and lots of other cooking shows, and they talk about, you need to balance the sweetness with some sharpness. And for me, I think it's the opposite, where I need to balance the darkness with humor, and lightness. And I remember a movie. I am straying away from my point that I was going to make, but I remember a movie that came out probably 15 years ago called Crash, and it was about race in Los Angeles,
Yeah.
and it was so heavy, as
Mhm.
is appropriate. But at the end, I remember like just being so down afterwards, and there were no light moments in it. And for me, it took away from my appreciation of it, because sometimes you just need a moment, even if it's brief,
Yes.
to reel you in a little bit off of just that heaviness and the darkness. But for me, when I'm writing, I find that a lot of that comes in the nuance and detail, like you're talking about, and also in very intentional word choices. And I don't know that I would be able to verbalize when I'm making a particular word choice why. But for me, like, it just feels like the right word in that moment to convey that particular emotion or detail. And I always remember a quote from, or that at least I read as attributed to Mark Twain, as saying that the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug.
Right.
And I think that is true in writing, and particularly in humor writing.
Yeah. Well, I love that you bring that up, because again, I think much of the successful humor comes in the revision stage, right down to the line editing word choice stage. I mean, I remember switching at the last minute the detail of Citibank for Deutsche Bank, because Deutsche Bank was funnier, and it wasn't a factual thing, it was just a thought I had. And so right down to that word choice. But I particularly also want to reference what you were talking about, that I agree that across genres, having some element of humor, whether it is to balance the darkness, or even in my case, more to better characterize people the way they are, which is often sort of quirky, funny, in their specifics or the details, adds a deeper characterization. So it achieves so many levels. It gets rid of the relentlessness of maybe whatever the genre's, emphasis is. But I also think that it further characterizes it. It adds a level of engagement. I have a detective series that I loved. It's the long running one, but honestly, the last 5 or 6 I couldn't read because it was so relentlessly humorless, and that affected the characterization. It made the characters seem flatter. So I love the police procedural part of it. These were serious crimes in this series, but it felt like a fault of characterization when there was not a single person that did something quirky, or once in a while said, something funny, or more often, if the point of view character would think something, because a lot of the humor in my essays, but I think a lot of the humor also stems from the point of view character's thoughts. In our thoughts, if we're authentic, they're often not, maybe a little bit, I don't know, inappropriate or quirky. I know I'm overusing that word. And so one of the things that I do to help feed, I'll call it humor, but also, again, use almost synonymously the humanity in my stories, is to be very observant, pay attention to what people are doing, pay attention to the details that stand out to me. That apron example is one I gave you. And also pay attention to what's going on between my own ears. As an essayist and a writer in the personal essay genre, much of what's on the page is my point of view, my stream of consciousness, my reactions, my commentary, internal commentary, my interiority. And when I really pay attention into it, I think a lot of the humor came from that. Not because I was trying to be funny, but it's things I noticed or thought. And I think it served the essay collection well because it made me more human and three-dimensional by capturing those thoughts authentically. And it also added an element of funny, so yeah, it's interesting. Humor is not something reserved only for humor writers. It absolutely, finding the funny, feeding the funny, works across genres.
This is such an interesting conversation. I'm currently listening to, I was just looking at my phone, The Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie. Is British sort of whodunit. It's first person with a little, very precocious little girl, and it's a little bit historical. I think it's in the 1950s, maybe the 40s. I don't know. Anyway, and I don't like the narrator, so usually that is a hard pass for me. But the analogies that this writer uses are so clever and so tell who this character is, of course, but they're just funny. And they've kept me in, and I kept thinking, I need to really notice his technique and import it. One fun that I heard this morning was, she was talking about, she could have said, the inspector looked surprised, and she didn't say that. She said, it was like a pie in the face. Yeah, see, yeah, and that's what I did. And so that kind of stuff, for those of us who don't think, I couldn't be a comedy writer, I couldn't write a comedy script or something, but what you're telling us, you don't have to, just notice the details, notice the words.
Yeah, I don't think they're different in terms of the craft that we use to write in any genre. It's just paying attention to the quality of the narrative through that particular lens. And it still harkens back, is that the best detail you can use to characterize the person or the setting? Is that the best dialogue you can use to characterize the person or the setting? Particularly the interiority of your point of view character. What would she really be thinking? God, it looks like he got hit in the face with a pie. Can feel like more authentic internal monologue than he was shocked, which is a narrative telling kind of quality. So it's really, there is no hard, fast line. I mean, I'm sure that if you're a Dave Barry or something, that's a whole different type of humor writing. But in terms of just wanting to tell a good story with authentic three-dimensional characters, and you have a point of view character who you're going to allow us access into her or his or their internal mindset, then humor can be looked at with that, and it's just adding even more authenticity where appropriate. And again, harkening back to the first thing that I was saying or thinking about, and not pushing it too much, But we are, again, that it really helped when I understood, in response to the reaction of people saying, oh, your essays are so funny, and I'm looking at some of the subject matter, death and loss, when I equated humor and humanity, and when I really then thought too, and it was in the revision process that I did the humanity better, and often that's where the humor came forth, so yeah, but they're the same things we all have to work on across genres. So
and when I think about how to do this intentionally, to incorporate it intentionally, there are different angles, because every occupation and profession is going to have, like you were talking about your police procedural you were reading earlier, and that it didn't have humorous elements. But, first responders like that are going to have a particular kind of humor. Mm-hmm. And, my wife is a nurse, and I guarantee you at the hospital, there is a particular genre of humor that is going to be natural to that mm-hmm. workplace. And whether it's a bank or an office or, miners, coal miners, whatever it is. And not only that, but like my novels, particularly the last couple that I've written, are very culturally Southern. Like, I'm from Texas, but I live in Alabama, and there is a humor and a sensibility to this part of the world that is going to be different from other parts of the country. And so just being able to, if you're writing a book that is specific to a certain place, being able to identify that humor and incorporate it. One of the things I liked in your article was you need to be sure that the humor you're not weaponizing your humor. And
Right.
if you're from the South and you're identifying things that are humorous to our particular culture, you need to make sure that you're not pointing and laughing at, but that
Yeah.
these are natural
Oh, that's huge.
tendencies. So we delve into that a little bit because I think that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you made two really good points. Was one of the things to me, the gift of reading is, and it's a gift that only reading allows, is we are sharing somebody's interiority, which we even in a play or a TV show, we can't quite do that unless there's a voiceover. But and so to allow the reader full access to the interiority, and particularly their unique internal perspective, it's going to be better if you also allow the way they really think and that particularized bit of humor to come through, the way a nurse might see the world, or a prosecutor or whatever. So that, I think, is a huge double whammy of the beautifulness of writing. Is not only do we get a character's interiority, but we get a particular character's interiority based on their life. So that, I think, is another reason why humor can organically, your word was natural, which I like even better, sift into our writing. But then on top of that, you made a really good point. But it's not funny to punch down. It's not funny for me, a Vermonter, to suddenly make those lame judgments about, I don't know, Southerners, or this side of the aisle or that way. We can put ourselves in a bad light if it's authentic to how we think, but it's just not funny, nor does it serve to force judgments on other people, particularly when we think we're being funny doing it, when all it is cliched or limited or whatever. So it works only if it's quite clear in the personal essay genre that the limitations are mine, that when I think something like, oh, those crafters, I have this big essay about how I just can't handle women who craft all the time. It's clear I'm not making fun of them. I'm making fun of my own blind spots, that I just don't get it. So yeah, that is a huge test when you read. Does it just look like you're forcing a judgment about another person or a character if it's fiction, or even a group, on the reader, as if you're so right about them? Or if you're making a judgment, it needs to be clear it's your warped perspective, and so yeah, that's a huge part. That's why feedback, I think, is really important, to get some readers, to make sure at the end or wherever it serves, because I wrote a book on feedback. I'm huge on getting feedback when it serves, but to make sure that when we put humor or anything in there, it's coming across the way we want it. It's not coming across like a mandate that you have to feel this way as well. So
I like your watchword of humanity. I think if you strive to show someone's humanity within the situation, you're not going to do that.
Yes.
That make fun of somebody else kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's very helpful.
Yeah. And, it makes you such a better writer too, when maybe your early drafts, are full of judgments and easy targets and punching down and all that. But that's why they're their early drafts. It makes you a better writer to have to revisit it. Now let's really put that character on this stage, not to sugarcoat them, but to just put on the stage so the reader can form her own judgments. Are they doing something that is kind of funny? Are they saying something that feels authentic, but is the way humans talk? Or is the point of view character thinking something that feels the way humans, and particularly that character, would think? And yeah, that reference or reminder that what you're really trying to capture on the page is humanity opens up the world of humor writing to everybody, because it's just or opens up the realm of humor, not humor writing, but humor to everyone, because sometimes the better selection is the funnier line, the more ironic or maybe even questionable thought, the action that's a little bit more showing, but also is entertaining. So yeah, I think it shows more the dimensionality of both the point of view character, but even the characters in the story that surround the point of view character. So yeah, but I very often, that better detail, that better action for me was in the later revision. I try to get the scene right in my mind and, glop it onto the page as best I can. I'm a writer who has to rewrite a ton of times, but then that everything from that bigger revision to the finessing of it down to the word choices definitely came in later drafts. So it's very, I think, undercutting for me anyway, to start out, especially with this echo mirror, oh, you're so funny, you're such a funny writer, to start out trying to be funny. I can't write at all then, because A, I'm sitting there not feeling funny, and B, it's the work of writing to get the scene right, and that's where the funny is evoked, not necessarily in the beginning. And certainly my stories, and I would argue why this is works across the genres, they're not funny stories. The story itself, oh, a funny thing happened to me, that none of my stories are overtly funny. It was sort of my reaction or the little nuances that made them more human, and often in that case then more funny.
So you talked about writing about your own blind spots. How do you balance that with taking it too far into self-deprecation so that it almost seems self-pitiful?
Yeah, what a great question. And you know, sometimes in the reviews of the book, which I'm very pleased with, but somebody will just use that phrase, and I think they mean it in a positive sense, you know, and she's so self-deprecating, but I wince because I think you cross that line and it tanks the whole essay. It feels false. It feels like now you're just sort of slumming to make yourself look weirder or less able or whatever. And it doesn't feel authentic, and it makes me just like not even want to read in the personal essay genre about this person if she's going to do all these lame brain things, you know, to that degree. So you're right, you don't want to milk that too hard. And there's some of my peers in the essay genre, you know, women in midlife, right? I think they cross that line, and they, for the sake of humor, sometimes it's hard to tease out, because exaggeration is a little bit of humor, especially with your thoughts like, oh geez, it looks like you got socked in the face with a pot. That's exaggeration, but it feels authentic, so it works.
Yeah.
But sometimes, so exaggeration has its place, but sometimes I'll read some of these collections that are out there and doing really well and have tons of readers who love them. So this is coming from a personal place, but I just feel like you're just making yourself out, you're pushing it, that you're hurting more than you are, you're messing up more than you are. And who am I to say that? But it reads a little false in the text. You know, I don't know these individuals, but that's a line I don't want to cross. So I'm really glad you brought that up. And in a last read of the essay collection, I would make sure I tried not to do that, because A, it's not accurate. I'm not a mess up all the time, but B, when I do, I want it to feel authentic, you know?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And on a different angle on that, I just finished reading an extraordinarily popular fantasy book that has romance elements, which I'm not a romance reader. I'm not the intended audience for this book. But the romance, like the emotional side of it, was so, for me, personal preference, it felt so over the top as to be inauthentic.
Yeah.
Or it could be that I'm entirely too stoic of a person, because I just kept coming away thinking, like, do people really feel things this strongly? Like, and maybe that's just the genre and I'm not the right reader for it. But I just thought that I thought about that in correlation to what you were saying about making sure it feels authentic and not over the top, and coming back to, I feel like, what has been our cornerstone of the entire conversation, of coming back to the humanity and being true to it.
Yeah. Well, I think for writers, it's, oh, go ahead, Barbara.
I was just going to say, I think it doesn't everyone a disservice if you are too self-deprecating or whatever, because people read you and look at you and maybe they admire you, and it just does no one any good if you say, oh, I'm really bad at this, or, you know, I'm stupid, I'm whatever. Well, no, you're not. You are an intelligent person, but own the things. It is good to be vulnerable and share the things that you are not good at, but don't overblow anything.
Don't undercut your own competence.
No imposter syndrome, people. I think there is far too much of that. I think we all get to own our own strengths. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. And I think maybe in the humor category, maybe then that's done because that's the buy-in. But we're in the category of realism, whether it's personal essays or fantasy or romance, then that believability, I think, and authenticity really matters to characterization. And so, yeah, if you push it or try to make them whatever, it doesn't work. And of course, I appreciate what you were saying, JW. Writers should write the way they want to write, as long as they apply craft and know it, but if they want pure escapist and it's over the top, and there will be readers for that. So writer writes what she wants, and it's probably better for that and better for the readers that prefer that. But in my realm, I write not my realm, but my preference as a writer, why I sit down and put in all these hours, is because I like to find the extraordinary in the ordinary. I like to find the humanity in regular people. And we're again maybe using those almost synonymously, humor and humanity. And so that exaggeration doesn't fit with my goal of what matters to me when I write something and release it to readers. So it just doesn't work. And I just love that when I'm reading other genres, and it's the same with TV shows too. And it could be a police procedural, or a cop show, or a dark thriller, and yet there are those people being real people. And sure enough, there's those little bits of whatever, humor or fallibility or funniness that comes through. It only makes the story, I think, more compelling. And the contrast, that's your word I'm borrowing, JW, actually adds a dimensionality to the show or the manuscript that wouldn't be there if that one element was overlooked. Because that's what I think it is. I think it is often, it's not that these writers can't include, they do good characterization, but I think they overlook humor as one more thing to kind of check in on. Are you forgetting to pay attention to this element?
Well, I think that's a perfect place to bring the conversation about this to an end, because it draws all those points together. But before we go, I want to make sure people know where to find you and your work, so they can read your essays or, attend any of your seminars that you do.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, my author website's probably the best place, www.joni, JoniB.com. So it's just my name, JoniBCole.com. And there's a link to the writing classes that I teach online if you go through there. And so, yeah, I'd love to hear from, listeners and readers. And I'm so grateful for this chance to kind of talk directly to your audience, because I love this show.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I really enjoyed this conversation about humor and humanity, and just look forward to keeping on following what you're doing as well.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Barbara and JW.
Thank you. I'm writing again this afternoon. I'll be thinking about this. Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.